Welcome into the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I am here with another edition of the Roundup with my co-host Jeff Cohen. We are very excited to be back and talk more baseball with everybody like we did last week. It's an exciting time. Spring training starts this upcoming weekend. We're seeing a lot of really fun videos from all the different camps around baseball of, minor league guys, major league guys. Everybody's basically reporting to camp right now this week. So, the pitchers and catchers were at it. We saw some cool videos from White Sox spring training of guys like, Dylan Cease at camp and some of the other young pitchers that we're really excited to keep an eye on, in addition to a lot of the 70 players that are on the invite list for Major League Camp. There's 26 spots for the White Sox and then 70 players technically competing for those 26 spots. And while obviously there's a fair share of those players who are minor league guys and prospects within the system that will most likely not make the roster, you never know what's going to happen. And there's a handful of guys that could be on this roster and a lot of position battles to kind of keep an eye on. So how are you doing, Jeff, first of all, and how you feeling about spring training?
Well, I'm a little mad, Elijah. I didn't get my non-roster invitation. How about you?
I must have missed mine in the mail as well.
Yeah, we're about the only guys, but it's exciting. It's so close. It's so close. Even though, this is going to be a throwaway season, there are a lot of prospects to follow, and it's going to be fun. And a lot of the top prospects are going to be at spring training, so we'll get an early look at Colson and Brian Ramos and guys like
Yeah.
that.
No, I completely agree. It's an exciting time for baseball as a whole, and especially for the White Sox, I think. And we're just looking forward to doing a lot of things in terms of covering and watching everything going down. So on today's episode, our main focus today is going to be a little bit of a fun side project that we've been talking about for a few weeks, and we finally get to do it on the air. We'll talk a little bit of roster stuff first, but the main purpose of today's podcast is to do a 2026 opening day roster projection. So me and Jeff both have put together our rosters for 2026 as we kind of embark on this rebuild of sorts with the White Sox. A lot of this year, as we've talked about, is focused on the future and focused on what's next for the White Sox. So we figured it would be a good time to look at, 2 years from now, what this team could look like if things work and things fall into place between the combination of having a lot of money available in the next few years, hopefully to spend on some free agents, in addition to, a lot of these young players that we talk about all the time that will be competing and making an impact at the major league level. And then in 2 years from now, hopefully. So before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit of spring training positional battles. I just want to do this off the rip with you to kind of get an idea of where we're at, because, there's some players, obviously Luis Robert, Dylan Cease, that are the key pieces. And I think some positions are locked down, but there's a lot of spots on this roster that are pretty up for grabs. When you look up and down the White Sox roster right now, there's at least, I would say, 2 to 3, maybe even 4 in terms of position player spots that are kind of open. There's really only 8 or 9 guys that you can lock into a major league spot in terms of the position players. And then on the pitching side of things, there's a few, I think. In terms of starters, Cease, Kopech, and Eric Fetty are kind of the guarantees. Mike Soroka, if he's healthy, seems like a pretty sure bet. Beyond that, the bullpen, right? Like, there's a chance Garrett Crochet starts in the minor leagues. Gregory Santos is out the door, right? So, essentially, I'd say pretty much the entire bullpen is up for grabs, in addition to at least 1 or 2 starter spots. So, what is your thoughts on some of these battles, Jeff? And who do you see being some interesting names to watch that you think are going to make the roster that aren't necessarily locked up yet?
Well, you're right. There are position battles all over the place. You've got the middle infield. Do they give it to a young guy like Braden Shoemake, or do they, Nicky Lopez go with some guy they can trust, some guys with a little more experience? Same thing in the outfield. Tons of guys. It's going to be interesting to see from my perspective, since I covered the Knights, who's going to take their demotion, come down to Charlotte. Like every year, we've got a lot of veterans down here, and I imagine it'll be the same this year. It's interesting. We could have a reunion of sorts. If Gavin Sheets is sent down, if Mark Payton is here, you'd be getting the band back together again.
Yeah, completely. It's tricky because you got all these non-roster invites, and a lot of them will end up in Charlotte because, you need depth, and that's kind of where the league is trending right now, where there's a lot of depth pieces that end up playing in AAA in hopes that, once an injury comes or once somebody's performing poorly, that they can then take that spot at the major league level. But there's a lot of players who, are at camp right now that want to be on the big league staff, and they've been big league players before, and they don't want to be sitting around in Charlotte. So, this is the time the next month for guys to fight. And unlike previous years, like, there's spots open. The roster is not settled whatsoever. I think the bullpen is totally up for grabs. I think, there's been some recent signings. Brian Shaw was brought back on a minor league deal. He was great down the stretch last season, but is he part of whatever the future looks like in the bullpen. Corey Knebel brought in last week, Dominic Leone, a bunch of veteran guys who are all going to be competing for spots. But what does that turn out to be? I have no idea. I think it's going to be pretty contested. And then, Mike Moustakas brought in this past weekend on a minor league deal with an invite. This is a guy who was at one point a really solid player in the major leagues and then hasn't had the best go at things the last 2 years, I think. But, does he take a spot from a Gavin Sheets, right? Both similar kind of profiles, power over everything. They haven't had a ton of average in their careers. I mean, Sheets is a guy, right, who's been on the roster the last few years, but he doesn't have a spot locked up. And same thing goes even for a Lenine Sosa, who most people expect to be kind of the backup infielder. What if Danny Mendick comes into spring camp training and is better than him, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of things to consider. What do you think about that backup infield job? Where would you go with that if you kind of had an opinion on that?
Well, that's interesting. You and I have been talking for a couple of weeks about this season is all preparation for the 25-26 seasons. So if that's the case, do you go with the young guys? Do you give Oscar Colas another shot? And then in terms of the backup infielder, you go with a guy like Lenine Sosa, or, you probably have a high comfort level with a veteran like Danny Mendick. But in the long term, is that really what you want to do?
Right. It's tricky. It's just towing that line between being competitive right now and having the best team possible, but also knowing that this is about the future because that's what we all know it is. And Kevin Pillar, I think I've seen as someone you mentioned earlier, who is a favorite to make the roster right now because at the end of the day, like beyond, I mean, I think the starting outfield right now pretty clearly looks to be Benintendi, Robert, and Dominic Fletcher, who was acquired in the Mena trade. Fletcher is somebody who's league ready. He showed he was good at the major league level last year as a prospect, so I think he kind of has the edge on that third outfield spot. But the fourth outfield spot, who knows, right? I mean, yes, Oscar Colas, maybe you give him a second chance, but like he did not look like a major league player last year, so maybe he needs to be in Charlotte for the time being. And Kevin Pillar, who has proven he can play defense at all three outfield positions, might be the better fit for the team right now, even if he doesn't help the future necessarily. So it's
Right.
it's just this weighing of future versus present and vets versus potential, because there's a ton of vets at camp right now. And it's just about figuring out which ones are worth keeping around versus which ones you probably can let walk or let play in Charlotte for a while. So it's going to be really interesting to follow. I think I'm going to be very carefully tuned into kind of the positional battles because, like I was saying, fourth outfielder totally up for grabs. Second base / backup infielder totally up for grabs. Whoever the utility / power bat is on the bench, whether it's Gavin Sheets, Moustakas, or they go with a Mendick who can play infield and outfield, something like that. Those are all up for grabs. It seems like Max Stassi has by far the lead on the backup catcher job. I don't think it's completely locked up, but it does seem like he's going to be the backup catcher with Maldonado, or at least the two of them kind of platooning. And then, the bullpen is who knows. And the rotation is the same way. The rotation there's probably 10, 11 guys that could in a world make the rotation, honestly, with those back two spots in the starting rotation. So it's really tricky, and we're going to be keeping an eye on it. But let's dive into our main segment for today. We'll have a lot of spring training talk soon. And for those who don't follow us, definitely make sure to follow Jeff at AAA Jeff on Twitter and myself at Elijah EV8. We are going to be talking plenty of spring training. We'll be posting stuff. I'll be out there for a while. Definitely want to check out our content because we're going to be bringing it for the next month of spring training. But let's dive into this, Jeff. I know you're ready for this. I'm excited for this. We're going to talk 2026 roster projection. So the way I want to do this, we're going to start with hitters, and Jeff and I are kind of just going to both go back and forth, and we're going to have some similarities, of course, because there's certain players that we all know we want to be on the 2026 roster, but we're also going to have some differences for sure. So I'll start it off. 2026 opening day catcher, Edgar Caro. I don't want to overcomplicate it. I think I think Max Stassi is a solid player. I think, Carlos Perez has shown some stability. Corey Lee could continue to develop a little bit in AAA this season. Edgar Caro is the future of this position. We've talked about it before. Who do you have at the catcher spot?
Well, I told you before we started, I took a little bit of a contrarian view,
Yeah.
and I said, it's not unrealistic. Michael Turner could be the first guy up and win the job.
I like that.
They're
That's
a little out
interesting.
of the box, but
That's
yeah.
a fascinating take right there. So that's interesting you say that because I'll just cut to the chase then. In this situation, I had Turner as my backup catcher actually. So I also think he could be a guy that makes the roster. You know, an older prospect, right? He's definitely a much higher age than most catchers at the Winston Salem at the high A level. But he was great last year, and I think his ability to call a game and his ability to be patient at the plate is something that could be really useful. So that's why I had him as the backup catcher for this team actually. So I think interesting. What is it? What about Turner gives you reason to believe that he could be the starting catcher?
Well, in 2 years he's going to be 27, so it'll be his prime years. Whereas Cuero will be what, 22, and still
23, yeah.
23. Yeah, so
Yeah.
still a touch young. He could use maybe half a season of seasoning.
Yeah, that's a good take. I think we look at 2025 as a year when you could see Caro making a major league debut potentially, but if he starts a little slow, there's a world where the older Turner gets a stab at the regular position while Caro continues to develop. So that's a really interesting take there. I kind of like that, and I do think Turner is somebody that we should keep an eye on because despite the age and that the age kind of shifts people away from prospects at times, but Turner's someone who produced a whole season last year and really just looked like a consistent matured player. He might struggle offensively as he rises up the ranks in the minor leagues. I think there's always a risk with that. But generally speaking, he knows how to call a game for sure. He looked consistent behind the plate, and he's someone who just at his age could at 27 years old could be a viable catcher for this team. All right, we'll go to the next position. So right now, Jeff's got Michael Turner catching, and I've got Edgar Caro catching. If you had a backup catcher, did you have Caro as your backup
I
catcher?
did, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we both got the same two catchers, just a level of age maturity about who's necessarily starting opening day. But I like that. That's good. Moving over to first base, I stuck with Andrew Vaughn. I know a lot of people are really frustrated by the lack of kind of that next step for Vaughn. I think the last 2 years it's been like, where's his star level potential that we thought he had when he came up for the White Sox? The guy came up playing, getting stuck in the outfield when Eloy got hurt in his first season, and he had to play left field. Then he had to get shifted over to right field at one point, and really just had a rocky career with Abreu being at first for a while and him kind of just being all over the place. Last year was his first full season as the 100% first baseman for the White Sox. I believe in him. I believe in the bat. I believe in the mature approach. I still see it for Vaughn, and I still think he's still going to be in arbitration at that point. So he's still a guy that he'll be under contract in 2026, and I know that there's a popular first baseman who I'm curious to see if you mention here, but there is someone that a lot of people like and think could take the job over from Vaughn, and that's a possibility for sure. But I think in 2026 that Vaughn still has this job. I think this coming season he takes a step forward. He shows that he could be an everyday first baseman in this league, and then come 2026, he's still the first baseman, even if he's not much beyond that.
Well, again, I have two things happening that are going to take us in a different direction and end up with Brian Ramos. Number one, that in 2026 it'll be Andrew Vaughn's ARB 3 year.
Yep.
And I think the White Sox might not feel like they're getting their money's worth, and they don't want to pay him.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is huge, this dominates every other decision I make, is it's very possible Colson Montgomery gets too big to play shortstop and they move him to third. Right?
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very possible, right?
Yeah.
And so if that happens, I said, what would be the ramifications? Number one, I think you'd have great defense at third base with Colson there. That would shift Ramos to first base if he's going to start. And right now, yeah.
So I like that a lot because I kind of went with the more positionally straightforward cookie cutter approach, and I really like that you took a different approach there. So what do you see with Ramos kind of going forward? Do you think that he comes up at third still and then eventually moves to first, or do you see a world where Colson shifts to third when he comes up and Ramos kind of immediately slots into first sooner than 2026? Or do you kind of see that being his first season taking over at first base, assuming Vaughn gets moved?
Yeah, I could see Ramos coming up and replacing Moncada initially, as Colson continues to get bigger and they see if he can stick it short or not.
Yeah. Interesting. So then, in terms of Vaughn, if that, so 2026 is his arb 3. I like that you pointed that out. So I kind of was like, oh, that might be, if even if they don't want to continue with him, that would be his last season as the starter at first. Do you think Vaughn gets traded that season before?
I could see that. Yeah. I actually I thought, who are all the guys that could be off the roster?
Yeah.
And I said, Vaughn, Eloy, hopefully he has a good year and they can flip him.
Yep.
And the other guy I thought might be off the roster, if he can have a good year, is Benintendi. And I think they would love
That's
to move him. And if some team's in a pennant race and you need a good on base outfielder, it could be Benintendi if he regains his old form.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're gonna get to Ben and to the outfield in a little bit, but you kind of just hinted at it, so we'll just dive into it. Third base, we'll go corners, and then we'll go up the middle from there. Third base, I assume you have Colson Montgomery based on that
Right.
discussion.
Right.
Okay, what do you see Colson being at third in comparison to what he's at short? If you've kind of thinking about his defense a little bit, especially.
Well, I think he's good. I think he's would be an elite defensive third baseman, and I think he'd probably be, maybe a league average defensive shortstop. So I think there'd be a big upgrade there, but that opens up a Pandora's box as to what you do with your middle infield, and I really was scratching
Yeah.
my head trying
So
to solve that one.
that's interesting. So before we get to that, I went with Ramos. I think he sticks at third. I think in again, it does come down to Colson because can play a good third. I think Ramos would be great at first probably because he would be able to. I mean, any ground he does at first, even if it's less often, he would totally handle well. And I think he's got the size to be able to manage first base. He's not super tall, but he's tall enough for sure. So it's interesting you put him there. But I did have Ramos sticking at third just on the fact that I know he's a really good defender there. Ramos's defense has continued to get better. So I think that because both these guys with Ramos and Colson are kind of on the same timeline right now, that if Colson can stick it short, that essentially guarantees third to be Ramos's job, come 2025 with Moncada being off the books after this current season. So, I went with Ramos. I stuck with him there. I think he's an above average, a slightly above average defender at third base. And I think, if he continues to really just add to his approach and continue to raise the walk rate like he did this past season, he's someone that you could see being, a consistent 20 home run, solid contributor at third base while playing really strong defense there. So I stuck with Ramos at third, and you've got Colson. So right now you've got Ramos at first and Colson at third, and I have Vaughn at first and Ramos at third. So what does your shortstop look like, Jeff?
Boy, this was tough. I said maybe they just go with a defense first guy like Shoemake. He's a great glove, hasn't shown the ability to hit. Maybe Jacob Gonzalez, comes on and just shoots up through the system. But I actually thought that they would just end up going out and getting a free agent. And I looked to see who the free agent shortstops were, and I came up with Jorge Mateo, that he's expendable in Baltimore, and he's a good glove and a lot of speed. They go free agent.
Interesting. That's a good take. So is Mateo, I'm going to check right now. Mateo looks like he's up after 2025. So it would be that offseason, basically, essentially them signing him after 2025 to take over the shortstop job going into 2026 so I think with your plan, what's interesting about your kind of infield right now is I think that would make a lot of sense if Colson and Ramos spent 2025 at short and third, and then kind of figured out that Colson should move to third ideally, in which case that offseason you shift Ramos to first and you sign a shortstop to then fill that gap. So that's an interesting plan there. And Mateo's someone who, I think he had a really rough second half of the season in 2023, but the first half of the year he was playing really well last year, and someone who's an elite defender, has a lot of speed. He's only 28 years old right now, so he'd be 30 at that point. And it's just someone in general who is the glove and the speed talk, and the bat has had moments of being strong. And like you said, he's got no spot in Baltimore pretty soon, I think. I'm not even sure if he makes it through his ARB 3 with Baltimore. I think there's a good chance he actually gets traded before then, just because Jackson Holiday, Gunnar Henderson, Kobe Mayo, it goes on and on and on in Baltimore. We've talked about that system and how stacked it is. So I'm interested to see if Mateo makes it to free agency. I think there's a chance he gets traded, but maybe the White Sox are a team that looks to trade for him in 2025 or after even 2024. Who knows if the shortstop gap is still there and they want Colson to end up moving to third. So that's interesting. So you've got Mateo. I stuck with Colson at shortstop, if that wasn't obvious from the conversation earlier. I think He's getting there. I think the defense is getting there. And I think that the White Sox are going to give him every chance in the world to become the shortstop of the future just because of how valuable that position is. So even I could see a world he eventually moves to third, but I don't think it would be until 2027 or later, just because he is such a premium prospect and he is getting better. His movement's getting better. His range is still a little iffy. That's why the idea that he could shift to third makes sense, because his range can be a little bit limited at times at shortstop. But I do think he's getting better there, and I think he can be an everyday shortstop. So I stuck with Colson at short. Second base, another revolving door for the White Sox. I went with the free agent route. So you went with the free agent route at shortstop, and I'm curious to see where you went with second, because there's a lot of guys that within the team that could go to second. I think many people think Jacob Gonzalez will end up as a second baseman long term. You've got Popeye, you've got Lenyn Sosa, all those other options. I went the free agent route, and a different Jorge, actually. I went with Jorge Polanco, formerly of the Twins and currently of the Mariners, who the Mariners just acquired this offseason to kind of plug their hole in the infield. And Polanco's a guy who has dealt with some injuries and has had some ups and downs, but has been quietly really productive when he's been on the field. He can play a decent shortstop, but he can play a really solid second base. And he's someone who has just continued to produce. I feel like when I've watched him, especially against the White Sox, and when he's played for the Twins over the years, he has burned the White Sox a lot of times. And he's someone who has just got a nice blend of contact, a nice blend of power, a little bit of everything. He'll only be 32 when his contract is fully up after 2025. He does have a club option for 25, so there's a chance he could hit free agency this next offseason as opposed to in 2 years. But I think he's someone who, as a veteran ad, if the White Sox still haven't figured out second base, I could see Polanco making a lot of sense.
Yeah. I like that we both went with a free agent as one of the two middle infielders.
Yeah.
And, there is a lot of depth in the Sox system at
Sure.
second base, whether it is Popeye or Mario Camilletti. You got Ryan Burroughs, a guy that you talked to. It was a great interview with Edric Felix.
Yep.
He's a long shot, but I said that when they trade Eloy, they're going to trade him to Texas, and they're going to get back a top 20 prospect, Justin Foscue.
I like that a lot.
He's the second baseman.
I kind of love that, Jeff. I'm not going to lie. That's interesting. Foscue's a guy that I am actually a big fan of. I marked him as someone that if Texas were to kind of make a bold move and trade for Dylan Cease this year, which I thought they were a team that could have been in a dark horse for that type of situation because they're in such win now mode and they have a really deep farm system. Foscue was a guy that I was circling as like, let's get this guy to be the everyday second baseman.
Right.
He has done nothing but mash in the minor leagues. I don't know if you looked in deeply to his numbers, but the guy is a first round pick in 2020 and has just done nothing but hit and hit and hit. He's got some speed. He's up to speed a lot this past year after only stealing a few bags in his first two seasons. Last year, he stole 14 bags. He was, he's been an 850 plus OPS guy. He was an 862 OPS last year. Some sneaky power for not a huge dude. Second baseman putting out 17, 15, and 18 homers in his three minor league seasons. Foscue is a really interesting piece. And like you said, the Rangers are deep. And, Foscue doesn't really have a spot on that roster with Corey Seager and Marcus Semien set to be the middle infield there for the next decade, right? So
right.
I like that a lot. So are you thinking an Eloy trade this year potentially or next year?
Yeah. It's a coin flip. It could go either year. Hopefully he bounces back this year and he boosts his trade value this year.
Right.
So I'd lean 2025, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, I like that a lot, though. I think Polanco was someone who in my mind, I was like, this spot has been such a dead hole. You just get a veteran quality free agent. Right. But I also like the idea. I didn't actually factor an Eloy trade into a specific player on this roster. So I really like the idea of that because Foscue is someone who, doesn't have a spot on his team and is a really, really solid second base prospect. So that's fun. So your infield in 2026 opening day looks like Brian Ramos at first, Justin Foscue of the Rangers at second, Jorge Mateo at shortstop, and then Colson Montgomery moving over to third. I almost said the wrong Jorge there. Right. And then my infield looks like Andrew Vaughn, Jorge Polanco, Colson Montgomery, and Brian Ramos. So we have some similarities, some differences, kind of people moving all over the infield, but I really like the creativity you brought to that. And let's get it. And we both have Michael Turner and Edgar Caro as the two catchers ultimately. So
before we move on, let me just point out, if I had to put money on it, as opposed to play, theoretical, I definitely go the way that's what you have selected is
Yeah.
chalk and most likely what's going to happen. But there is that world in which Colson does move to third. You're right. It
Yeah.
might not be 2026. It might be like 2028.
Right.
But it will, whenever it happens, it's going to have a lot of ramifications.
Right. I love the creativity. You're right. Mine was definitely more of a chalk and kind of more like the most likely outcome. But I
Mm-hmm.
like the approach you took, and I think it's a really fun. I mean, that would be a fun infield. Those four players. Honestly, I think Foskey was a great idea. I love that. Actually, I considered doing a trade second baseman, but I went the free agent route. So I like that a lot. Getting into the outfield, let's start in left field. Obviously Andrew Benintendi is there right now and is under contract. For what is it, another 4 years, I believe. So that's a complication. Where did you go with left field? Is it Benintendi or is it someone else?
I put Dominic Fletcher in left field with the idea that Benintendi bounces back and, the White Sox eat a little bit of his contract, but are able to move him. And now that could be a stretch, but it's very possible he could bounce
Yeah.
back and have some trade value. So I've got Fletcher moving from right to left.
I actually had the exact same thing. That's funny. This is our first alignment so far. I had the same thing. I think eventually, I don't think it's this year. I think it's probably after 2025, realistically. I think the White Sox find a way to move Benintendi eventually, whether it's in 2024 or 2025, and they eat some of the money. I think you have to eat a decent amount of the money, honestly. But I think they find a way with all the young talent emerging to move his contract and to let Fletcher take over in left. Fletcher is going to open this season in right, but I think his profile fits a little better in left, honestly, as a guy who's super mobile. Can play well, can really just defend at a high level with his speed too. And I think Fletcher is someone who I'm excited to watch this season. I think it was as much as I was not a fan of trading Christian Mena, Fletcher is a fun player, and he could bring a lot of versatility and a lot of just energy to the outfield alongside Luis Robert. So I slotted him into left field, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Shifting over to center, where'd you go with this? I'm curious to see if the face of the franchise currently is still on the roster.
I did not get crazy here. I looked at Robert's contract, and the White Sox have two options for him at $20 million a year, and that's a steal.
Yep. I completely agree with you. There's no reason to get fancy here. If they were gonna, there was the idea they were gonna trade him this offseason, maybe, and consider it. I don't buy it. I just don't think you can trade a player of that caliber at his current contract rate too, especially like you said, he's right now, I think he's at 15 a year and then goes up to 20 a year for the 2 seasons beyond that. So I think, what is it, right? So right now this season is only 12.5 million, then 15 million next season, and then 20 the 2 years after that. He's not going anywhere. Luis
No.
Robert's going to be in center field. The guy is phenomenal.
Yeah.
If he's healthy, and that's obviously been a hard thing for him throughout his career, but if he can stay healthy, he's one of the people I penciled in at center field, and I didn't really think twice about it, honestly. So we're sticking with Luis Robert. I'm glad we're aligned there. So we've got the same outfield so far: Fletcher in left and Robert in center. And now we get to the position that has not been stable since Jermaine Dye.
Yeah. So I'm curious where you went.
You want me to? I'll start it off.
Yeah.
I went the free agent route. I think I could have gone the trade route. I think I kind of held off generally on a lot of the trade routes just because it's a huge if. I think that even in like a Dylan Cease trade or another trade, I think some of the prospects that get returned could still be really young pieces. So I didn't want to pencil a guy in that might not be ready yet. So I went the free agent route again, and I went with somebody who's a free agent after 2025. And that's Lane Thomas. Definitely not a super popular name, not somebody that necessarily stands out, I don't think. But Thomas has played for the Nationals in his career and is kind of sneaky, pretty good. I think he doesn't, being on a team that's struggled a lot, I don't think he gets quite enough respect, honestly, from what he's done the last 2 seasons. This past season with the Nationals, he was healthy pretty much the entire season. He strikes out a little bit too much, but almost 30 home runs, 20 stolen bases, and just a guy who I think it's just a solid piece. And I think if it's not a prospect, there's a lot of prospects I could have put in here. I think, if the Orioles decide to pony up at the deadline, maybe the right field's a Heston Kjerstad, or if, if it ends up being a Rangers trade for Dylan Cease, a Dustin Harris could make a lot of sense in right field. There's a lot of options out there. But ultimately, just as the safety of this exercise we're doing here, I went with Lane Thomas as a free agent signing after 2025.
Well, I like it. I like both the free agents that you were proposing, Polanco and Thomas. I like that. And I did the same thing. I said they can't solve right field. They go free agent. And I looked at the candidates. I thought about Lane Thomas and let's see, Lourdes Gurriel, Harold Ramirez, but I went with Austin Hayes from the Orioles.
I like that a lot too. I consider that. I definitely consider that. What is it about Hayes that made you go with him generally?
Well, a lot of this is going to have to do with affordability, right?
Yeah.
The White Sox are not going to go for the expensive top of the line free agent. The guy's going to be in his early 30s, probably going to get replaced by any number of White Sox prospects. He's a good glove, left-handed bat, and I don't think he's going to be that expensive.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the mind I was there with Lane Thomas. Honestly, it was the similar route of somebody that's good and a solid player that can be an everyday right fielder, but also not someone that's going to run up the bank and cost a ton of money. So I think either of those players on a 3-4 year deal potentially could make a lot of sense for the White Sox if they're looking to just get somebody to stick in right field, which I don't know if they ever will, but hopefully they will. So our outfields are both of us have Fletcher and Luis Robert in left and center, and then we both went with a free agent. You going with Austin Hayes in right, and I went with Lane Thomas. So two just veteran, solid corner outfielders that we stuck in right field to be the future at that position. Let's do DH. I think I'm curious to see. I have a hunch we might have the same person here, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the guy's Wilfred Veras. Is that who you're thinking?
That is my
Yeah.
guy. You take it away. Tell me why Varys.
Well, he's a great hitter, and he's demonstrated so far he can hit at every level, and so there's every reason to think he'll be a major league hitter. Now, the feel good story, kind of like Jake Berger was this great feel good story, would be Tim Elko.
Yeah.
But the odds are a little bit against it. And then I said, well, who are some of the free agents? And I thought maybe Kyle Schwarber, but no, I think they stay in house and they go with Veras.
Yeah, I'm at the same point as you. I think Varys does a lot of the things that Elko does, but is 5 years younger. And I like Tim Elko. I think there's a chance that Tim Elko just forces the hand and is the first baseman or DH come 2026. If he keeps hitting like he did last season, there's nothing stopping him really. But at the same time, I think Varys being 21 years old and just doing everything that he did last year and looking phenomenal in Birmingham down the stretch. I think he's not a major league option in 2024, but I think come 2025, he's going to be at the point where it's like, hey, this guy might need to get some looks. And I think he'll play some corner outfield here and there. He'll get a chance to be maybe even play some first base depending on the Vaughn situation. But generally, I think, come 2026, if all these other things fall in place, I like him to be the DH because, like you said, the bat is there. The bat, he can hit, man. The guy can hit the ball really hard. He's going to have to reduce the swing rate. We talked about this last week when we talked. You can go back and listen to our episode all about upper minors hitters in the system. He's got some approach issues. He's got to continue to cut down his chase rate and continue to down his swing rate. But at the same time, he can mash. I think if he figures out some approach things in the next 2 years, I could definitely see him being the DH going into 25.
Yeah, as Double A Birmingham, that's where we find out who are the real prospects. Everybody, a lot of guys look good in low A and high A, but it's Double A where you really prove that you're a prospect or not. And Veras has shown he can hit in Double A, and we haven't seen Elko do that yet.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think Varys is a good pick there, and I'm glad we were aligned there. So in terms of top-down lineups, I'll run through this real quick, and then I want to get into pitching because we're talking a lot here, and I'm enjoying this. This is fun. I hope everybody listening is enjoying dreaming about the future because I know me and Jeff are for sure. So Jeff's lineup looks like Michael Turner, Brian Ramos, I'm forgetting your second baseman.
Justin Foscue.
Right, Justin Foscue, exactly. I love that. Jorge Mateo, Colson Montgomery, Dominic Fletcher, Luis Robert, Austin Hayes, and then Wilfred Veras. And then on my side of things, we're looking like Edgar Caro, Andrew Vaughn, Jorge Polanco, Colson Montgomery, Brian Ramos, Dominic Fletcher, Luis Robert, Lane Thomas, and Wilfred Veras. So a lot of similarities there, some different positions, but both the lineups are interesting. I think either yours or my lineup would be something that I would enjoy watching more than the current team, and then that's ultimately the goal in a team that would be more competitive. So, all right, let's flip it over to rotation. Give me your first two starters and tell me why those are your first two starters.
Well, I'm going to go with the guy that I think we'll both have in our rotation, which is Nick Nastrini. I mean, he looks as much like a lock as anything in the system right now.
Yeah.
The other guy I went with, you asked for two, right?
Yeah, let's start with
the other guy I went with, and is it Eric Fetty? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
Okay.
Eric Fetty.
He's actually going to be a free agent, but I'm predicting that he's like the next Merrill Kelly, the guy who comes from
Right.
Asia and he's a little bit older, but he proves that he's a reliable starter. And I think the White Sox lock him up next year on a 3-year deal.
I like that. That's a good prediction. I really hope that's the case for Fetty. I've heard nothing but good reviews about the way he's adjusted his pitches when he was in Korea and he dominated there. So I think there's a world where Fetty clicks. And I think, the Sox signing him in a 2-year deal and saying, hey, we want you to be a key piece of our rotation for the next 2 years was a sign of some loyalty to him. And I think if he pitches well, there's a good chance they end up extending him. So I like that a lot. So Nastrini and Fetty to start it for you. My first one was Nastrini as well. I think, this is he'll be in the rotation in 2024, whether it's to start the year or whether it's mid-year. And I think, and going into his third season, I really do think he's going to be a key piece of this rotation. I think he's going to have some growing pains. I think the command is going to have, shakiness, but like we saw with Dylan Cease when he was coming up, Dylan Cease was really struggling as in his first year with the White Sox, even into his second year at times. And then you started to see that stuff shine through and just his ability to just get guys out and dominate hitters. I think Nastrini is going to be a similar way. I think we'll see a lot from him in 2025, and then going into 26, he'll be a really key piece of the rotation. And then my number 2 in the rotation is already a free agent, actually. And I went with someone who is coming off of a shaky season, not a great 2023, dealt with some injuries, wasn't as good as he had been in the past. And I don't think he's quite the level of pitcher that he showed in his breakout season. But I think, come free agency in 2025, I went with Nestor Cortez Jr. Of the Yankees. So
Yeah.
that was a little bit of a fun pick. I wanted to go with a free agent. I think that there's going to be a time in the next 2 years where the White Sox do spend substantive money on a starting pitcher. And I think that guy could be Nestor Cortez. I think he's going to be demanding a contract, of sizable contract. But at that time, he'll be 31 going into the 2026 season. And I think the White Sox will have enough money at that time to really go out and get a starter that they can put into a rotation with a bunch of young guys and feel solid about and feel like he's a veteran presence. He's different. He doesn't pitch nearly similarly to all these other guys that I have in the rotation. And I think he'll just be a fun veteran piece of the rotation to add to an otherwise pretty young group of guys.
Good. Very good. I like that.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was kicking around. I looked at all the free agents who were going to be available in 26, and I thought,
Yeah.
maybe they go out and get Michael Wacha, Tyler Mahle, somebody like that. But
Yeah.
I did not include one in my rotation.
Yeah. No, it's interesting for sure. But okay, so let's go 2 more. So we both started with Nastrini, and then you went retaining Fetty, and I went bringing in Nestor Cortez to be that second guy. Who are your 3 and your 4 in the rotation?
All right. Well, the third one is a guy I say they're going to pick up in a trade, and I say they're going to get Christopher Sanchez from Philadelphia. Is a left-handed starter, looked really good last year, and the piece going back is either going to be one of their excess catchers, Calvin Harris or Ronnie Hernandez, because they're set at catcher for a few years, with our predictions of Turner and Cuero. So all of a sudden they've got a trade piece, and I think maybe that and they throw in Jordan Sprinkle or something. The Phillies are going to be looking for a catcher to replace JT Realmuto by then.
What do you like about him that kind of fits that spot for you?
Well, he's a lefty, and he really came. He had a under the radar, really solid 2023. So
Yeah,
he'd be a good SP4.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's definitely an interesting guy, and he's still pretty young. I think he's 27 going into this season. So I like that idea. And then what's your next one? Your 4th guy.
All right. They're going to get something really good back when they trade Dylan Cease. And so I said, if they go with the Dodgers, it's going to be Kyle Hurt. If they go with the Yankees, it'll be Will Warren. If they go with Atlanta, it'll be Hurston Waldrop. They're going to get a good top arm back.
Yeah, I like that. I went an interesting way. So if you had to pick one of those guys, which one did you ultimately go with?
I would put the Yankees third in terms of pulling off a trade. The Dodgers, I love getting these Dodger pitchers. But I could easily see Atlanta doing something like that.
Maybe an AJ Smith-Shawver for sure. Could be an interesting idea from Atlanta as well.
Yeah.
I don't mind that. I think this was a okay. So you went Sanchez, and then you went a young trade pitcher from one of
Hmm.
those teams, which I like that a lot because one of my next two is also a trade candidate that I kind of factored in. Is the only person I factored in trading because I tried to minimize the trade aspect, but I do think that, like you said, the Cease return is going to be somebody. So the one I went with in that regard, and I changed this earlier today, but the one I went with was Chase Hampton of the Yankees.
Ooh.
I think
Oh, you think they prime away?
between Warren and Hampton, I think Hampton has a little bit more upside, has a little bit more to dream on. And I think the Yankees are going to get desperate. I really do. I think they're in the situation right now where they've committed a ton of money. They need to win. And whether it's before the season in the next month or at the deadline, they're going to get aggressive. And I think that Hampton's a guy that the White Sox would love to get their hands on, and someone that I could really see being a huge piece of the future if that clicks. So I went with Hampton, kind of similar route to you, in a trade, a big time trade piece coming from the Cease deal, because I think by 2026, Cease will be a free agent. And I do think that eventually the White Sox move him in a trade. So I first started with Hampton, and then I went with Noah Schultz, top pitching prospect within the system. I know that's a little bit bold based on his timeline, the injuries and the lack of innings and all those such things. But I think he's the rare case of a debut at the beginning of the season for a top pitching prospect. I don't think he debuts in 2024 or 2025. I think he's the type of guy who just figures who just gets enough innings in the next 2 years to the point where they say, you know what, he's too good to not be in the rotation, and he makes the 2026 opening day rotation.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And I had him coming up later in 26.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a
No,
month
which
or two.
it's
Yeah.
totally fair. I think that's a
Yeah.
that's a very fair assessment. This was just me being aggressive and bold and saying, this guy is the most
I love it.
talented pitcher in the system in terms of upside, and if he gets enough innings the next 2 years and he stays healthy, there's a world where he's on the roster. So
I
I
love
don't
it.
know. I'm it's definitely risky, but I think there's a really good chance. So who do you? So you're right now at Nastrini, Fetty, Christopher Sanchez, and then a trade piece like a Kyle Hurt or a Will Warren or an AJ Smith-Shawver in a Dylan Cease deal. Who is then your five to round out this rotation?
I will say, I love your pick of the guy from the Yankees.
Chase Hampton, yeah.
Yeah, they've been reluctant to trade him. Supposedly,
They
that's
have.
been the hang up in a trade with the Yankees. I
Him
love the
and
fact
Jones are
that
the two. Yeah.
yeah, I love the fact you think they're going to cave. That would be
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
It would be exciting for sure.
So my fifth pick, I went with Davis Martin, but and if you saw the video today, it was exciting. He
Yeah.
threw
It's good to see.
threw some pitches out in Arizona today, and he's on his way back. But the reality is, I went with Davis Martin, but that's really a placeholder for any number of these guys:
Yeah.
Jonathan Cannon, Seth Keener, Peyton Paulette, Mason Adams, Sean Burke. I mean, it could be anyone, but someone's going to emerge. It just seems
Yeah.
impossible that one of those guys, at least one, if not two guys, step forward.
I completely agree with you. That's kind of where I ended up just going with. I put two of those guys in the five spot. Just all of the guys you mentioned. I went with Mason Adams / Peyton Paulette. That was my five spot and my six starter, because you really need six starters is the reality. When you have guys that have injuries, you just have somebody missing a start. You need a six starter you can rely on. So I went with Mason Adams and Peyton Paulette as that 5-6 starters, because I like both those guys. I think Adams has been kind of the breakthrough guy. We talked about him a few weeks ago. He really just impressed the heck out of me this past season. And I think Paulette's a guy who, this is going to be his second full season coming off of TJ. I expect him to continue to get better. And I think he's someone that could even potentially debut in 2025, given his age. And if things click for him, he could be in the rotation. Or you go with the kind of the more high floor guy and more advanced guy in an Adams, who is not as much of a prospect pedigree, but is still someone that has performed so far and could continue to do that in the future. So those are the two guys I kind of put in that 5-6 spot. But overall, I really like both of our rotations. I got to say, I think it can be easy to get frustrated by the current reality of a rotation that's just totally in question beyond beyond Cease and Fetty right now. The rest of the rotation is very much up in the air, but there's a lot of pieces that could emerge in terms of the rotation. Assuming an Nastrini takes a step forward, assuming there's one or two free agents, like both of us said, or a trade piece. And in addition to all these different guys you just said, there's a lot of guys that could emerge from within the system and become rotation pieces.
And I think it's interesting, Elijah, of a couple of the names that we both excluded, Michael Kopech, Jake Eater, and Garrett Crochet.
Interesting. Why? What was your reasoning? And then I'll get into mine on any of those three guys not being part of the rotation.
Well, I actually put, one of the things we talked about was putting a couple of arms in the bullpen, and I had Eater going into the bullpen as being
Interesting.
one of the two most effective relievers.
That's fascinating. Okay, so I want to get into the bullpen in a sec because you're leading into it right there. But I don't think Kopech is on the White Sox in 2026. I don't think Crochet ever makes the full leap to being a starter. I'm not sure if he's still with the team at that point. I think there's a good chance he's with the team just because he is still young and he's still in the early process of his arbitration. But I don't think either of those guys are starters long term, in all honesty. And then with Eater, I think Eater's just a higher volatility guy. I think I could see him. There's a world where he's the two starter in the opening day rotation in 2026.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
also a world where he's bouncing between Charlotte or waivers or somewhere else. So I think I could see a lot of range of outcomes. I definitely thought about him, but I chose to ultimately go with a few guys that I think are a little bit safer in Paulette and Mason Adams. But I do think there's a chance Eater's upside just shines through. So I'm curious. That's cool. That's interesting you put him in your bullpen. I went with a different. I'm going to start by saying my first reliever, and we'll bounce back and forth. But I went with a different starter that I think could open his career as a reliever. Not necessarily stay as a reliever, but start there. And that's Grant Taylor. Grant Taylor is a super exciting pitcher. Coming off of Tommy John, the White Sox drafted him in the second round. He looked like he was going to be a first-round pick when he was pitching at LSU before he went down with the injury, and the White Sox were able to snag him in the second round. Taylor's a guy who this will be his first. He's trying to get his arm built back up, so he's really not going to have a full season. This will be a limited season in 2024. I think 2025 will be the year where you're like, oh, let's see the jump he can make. And then 2026, I think, trying to be cautious with him, and because of all the other depth that we're hoping will be in the major leagues in terms of starting pitchers, I think Taylor could open his career as kind of that Swiss Army reliever, spot starter, long reliever type role, and then eventually work his way into the rotation if things go well.
Yeah, I like it. But again, there's so many names that we talked about with Cannon and Adams and Burke and Paulette and all these guys. And a couple of them are going to be starters, and several of them are going to be, these two pitch guys in the bullpen who are really effective. I can absolutely see that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I started with Taylor, and you started with Jake Eater in your bullpen. Who was your? I ended up doing three, but who was your second reliever?
Well, I'm glad you did three because I didn't want to take the easy way and go with Jordan Leisure. So I went with a little bit more of a long shot, but Eric Adler.
I like that a lot.
He's looked really good so far. Again, he hasn't come up to Birmingham yet, where we'll find out really just what he can do. But so far, he's looked really good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good pick. Adler's someone who was sneaky, really good last year. I think I don't think it's. I mean, relievers generally don't get talked about all that much in terms of the minor leagues, especially at the lower levels, because he kind of came in as like, this guy is going to be a reliever. Most guys you draft and then you hope they're a starter, and sometimes they turn into relievers. Adler was always going to be a reliever, but I think that doesn't mean he's not super valuable and really impressive. A 2.87 ERA last season between Kannapolis and Winston, and just someone that had looked great in his first season. He's advanced. I think there's a chance he's up in 2025, honestly. So I like the Adler pick. Like you said, it is cookie cutter. And I think the difference between mine and yours is a little bit more creative than mine for sure. But I went with Jordan Leisure. I think Jordan Leisure, I don't just think he's the reliever. I think he's the closer. I think Leisure has closer stuff. I think he has the composure of a closer. I love talking with him. If anybody hasn't checked out that interview, that was one of my favorites I've done. The dude is just, he gives me energy of a guy who should be closing games. And that's something that I know is like so subjective. But I think Leisure has a decent year in his first year this year. And I think 2025, he really takes a step forward and shows that he is the future closer for this team, and then opens the season in 2026 as such. The last guy I went with, I want to mention real quick, because I ended up doing three relievers. I couldn't help myself, was Fraser Ellard. Fraser Ellard's another fun guy who is older, has dealt with some command issues over time, but really, really showed out towards the end of last year, and then looked good in the Arizona Fall League. It was really impressive. Him and Jordan Leisure had some awesome games where they both pitched an inning and they both dominated back-to-back innings for the Desert Dogs in Arizona. And I think Ellard's a guy who could really emerge among this group of a million relievers, and whether it be later in 2024 or even in 2025, potentially take a step forward and show that he should be a key piece of the bullpen. But I also did have Eric Adler as my other serious consideration there. So I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's a great pick as well.
Yeah. So we'll run through it real quick. In terms of the pitching staff, we got our roster set. So in terms of the pitching staff, you went with, and correct me if I'm wrong here because I'm trying to remember off the top of my head here, but you went with Nastrini, Fetty, Christopher Sanchez, a trade piece from a Dylan Cease trade, and then your last one.
I used Davis Martin, but really as a placeholder for any one of these young guys.
Right, exactly. And then you had your bullpen being Jake Eater and Eric Adler as two of the key bullpen pieces. And I know you obviously, if we had more than two, you probably would have put Leisure and maybe even, some of the other guys I mentioned as well. And then I went with Nick Nastrini, Nestor Cortez Jr. as a free agent signing, Noah Schultz, Chase Hampton as a return in the Dylan Cease trade, and then Mason Adams and or Peyton Pallette as the last starter. And then in my bullpen, I went with Grant Taylor starting his career as a reliever instead of a starter, and then Jordan Leisure and Fraser Ellard, who we both expect to see in 2024. So that was our rosters. I hope everybody liked hearing about that. This was a fun exercise, and it really just, I think this goes to show, there's a lot of guys in this farm system in comparison to a year or two ago that we could really see being big league pieces.
Right. And there's so many guys that we didn't even mention who could come out of nowhere and make the roster in 2026.
100%. Oh, you know what? I just realized we didn't even get to the bench spots. I didn't even think about that. I skipped over the bench spots, but we'll keep it brief because I know we've been talking about this roster for a while. But off my bench for the team, I went with Jose Rodriguez as the infield bench player and Jacob Burke as the outfield bench player. So two more guys that I think are fun prospects, exciting. I think Rodriguez, I talked about this a few weeks ago. I think Jose Rodriguez, I'm not sure he's an everyday player, but I think he could be a really, really good backup infielder, just given his speed and his defense and the power he can provide. And I think Jacob Burke is someone that I wouldn't be shocked to see Jacob Burke in either left or right field for this team as well, if he really continues to develop the way he did last year. But I also think he has the makings of a great fourth outfielder, given his defense, which is spectacular, and just overall solid contributions. Did you mark down any bench players?
I didn't have any bench players, but I like the two you went with. And in fact, I came so close to picking Rodriguez as my starting second baseman. Yeah. But the reality is, if they trade Eloy, they're going to get a pretty nice piece back. And if and when they trade Cease, they're going to get a nice piece back. Yeah. So I said, one of them's got to be a second baseman.
Yeah, I like that logic a lot. And I think there's a lot to be excited about. I think we just, for everybody listening, I hope you enjoyed hearing about this roster because, everything we're doing right now is really aimed towards a 2026 competition being a team on paper that, these two rosters that me and Jeff put together would be pretty exciting rosters. I'd like to think that these would be rosters that would make the White Sox a pretty competitive team that year. So thank you for listening. As always, this was the FutureSox RoundUp with Jeff Cohen and Elijah Evans, and we will be back to talk more White Sox minor league content next week, and we'll have some spring training to talk about, which is super exciting. So thank you all. Thank you, Jeff, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you.